Welcome to the History Guy podcast, Counterfactuals. What is a counterfactual? In the context of studying history, it is a kind of analysis where we examine what might have happened had historical events gone differently. As a thought experiment, the goal is to learn and understand history as it is by talking about what it could have been. As a twist on the historical stories that we tell on the History Guy YouTube channel, this is a series of podcasts that dwell on that eternal question: what if? I'm Josh, a writer for the YouTube channel and son of the History Guy. If you're a fan of the channel, you already know Lance, the History Guy himself. To liven up our discussions on what might have happened, we have invited Brad Wagnon, history aficionado and a longtime friend of the History Guy, to join us. Remember that if you'd like to support us, you can find us on Patreon, YouTube, and locals.com. Join us as we discuss what deserves to be remembered and what might have been. On today's episode, we travel to the lofty heights of the Andes, where in the early 1500s, Spanish under Francisco Pizarro came across the Inca Empire. The Spanish found the Inca at an opportune time, immediately following the end of a civil war, while wounds were still fresh and tensions ran high, soon culminating in the destruction of the empire. But it was a near thing, and the world could have turned out a lot different if events had gone differently. Without further ado, let me introduce the History Guy.
When the Spanish reached the borders of the Inca Empire in the late 1520s, the empire was at its height, covering some 2 million kilometers of modern-day Peru, Ecuador, Chile, and Bolivia. The empire had grown from a small kingdom centered around Cuzco in 1438 to become the largest empire in the New World, but contact with the Spanish would quickly bring that empire crashing down, but not without a fight. The most successful of the Inca resistance leaders was the Spanish-installed Emperor Manco Inca, who rebelled in 1535 and briefly threatened the Spanish control over the empire. It is history that deserves to be remembered. Manco Inca was one of many sons of Huayna Capac, born probably in 1515 at the height of Inca power. Manco was named after the legendary founder of the city of Cuzco, but in 1515 it seemed unlikely he would ever rule the empire. His father, Huayna, had as many as 50 wives and concubines, and is believed to have had more than 50 sons and as many as 200 children, the eldest born in 1490. But by the time Manco had become an adult, the situation in the empire had changed dramatically. At his birth, the Inca Empire was less than 100 years old. In the 13th century, the Inca coalesced into the Kingdom of Cuzco, led by the quasi-historical Manco Capac. Capac became the first Sapa Inca, which means the only Inca, a position similar to a European king and later emperor. The Kingdom of Cuzco was small, but became the core of the eventual Inca Empire. 2 centuries later, a new Sapa Inca rose to lead the kingdom. Pachacuti was not meant to inherit the throne, but when his brother and father fled from an invasion, it was he alone who rallied the defense of Cuzco and defeated the kingdom's foes. He took his name afterwards, which is often translated as Earth Shaker. Beginning in 1438, Pachacuti began expanding the kingdom's borders, conquering nearby tribes and ruling over growing prosperity. His son Tupac expanded the kingdom's borders even more, cementing them as the ascendant power in the region, controlling territory from Quito in modern-day Ecuador to Santiago in Chile, some 2,400 miles to the south. The Inca called their empire roughly the Kingdom of Four Parts, referring to the 4 provinces that Pachacuti formed whose corners met at Cuzco. When Tupac died in 1493, Manco's father, Huayna, became Sapa Inca. In the 1520s, the Inca started getting word of new visitors, the Spanish. In 1524, he died in Quito, possibly of a European illness, as did his eldest son. There was no clear rule about who should rule next. The sources disagree about whether Huayna was able to name a new successor, and if he did, who he chose. What is clear is that popular support quickly centered around 2 of Huayna's sons. Huáscar, who was supported by the Cuzco elite and the people, and his half-brother Atahualpa, supported by those in Quito and most of the Incan professional army. Manco at this time was just a boy, likely living in Cuzco, but not a contender for the throne. Huáscar had the advantage of being considered a pure Inca. That is, his parents were siblings, and therefore his bloodline came from previous Sapa Inca. Atahualpa's mother was a member of a royal family from Ecuador. Atahualpa was also wise in cultivating the support of some of his father's best generals. At first, Huáscar was probably declared Sapa Inca, and Atahualpa was made governor of Quito, though some chronicles suggest the kingdom was actually split in 2. Either way, the peace didn't last, as Huáscar seemed to have been suspicious of his brother and declared war on him in 1529. Atahualpa was captured in an early battle and lost an ear, but he quickly escaped and gathered his own supporters. Over the next 2 years, the two brothers fought each other in a series of fierce battles, with Atahualpa generally getting the better of Huáscar, thanks to the strategies of his generals. Huáscar was captured in 1532, and Atahualpa was declared Sapa Inca in May. Now about 17 years old, Manco was being hunted. After Huáscar's capture, Atahualpa's generals occupied Cuzco and proceeded to hunt down Atahualpa's many half-brothers and any prominent Huáscar supporters. Manco fled the city and went into hiding, but many considered Atahualpa and his Khitan forces to be invaders. Meanwhile, the Spanish had been probing at the edges of the Inca Empire for several years, seeking treasure. Francisco Pizarro sought to return to Tumbes, which he had visited a few years before. It was pure coincidence that when he arrived, he found the city burned to the ground, a victim of the Inca Civil War. Pizarro saw the Civil War as a golden opportunity. Atahualpa was in fact not far away, consolidating his forces after his ascension. He considered 150 or so foreigners as beneath his concern. He did send an advisor to the Spanish, who invited the Europeans to travel into the mountains, to meet the Inca himself. This proved to be a mistake, as the Spanish were given safe passage through some of the roughest terrain in the world. The roads were so bad that Francisco noted that they very easily could have taken us, for we could not have used the horses on the road, not even with skill. They came to Cajamarca, where Atahualpa's victorious army, possibly as large as 80,000 soldiers, was camped. Despite their fears, the Spaniards chose to attempt to capture the emperor. Atahualpa, who planned on trying to capture the Spaniards, arrived with several thousand unarmed soldiers, generals, and courtiers, only to be surprised when the tiny Spanish contingent struck. The Inca had never seen mounted warriors, and the Spanish massacred several thousand Inca and routed the rest. Atahualpa became convinced that all the Spanish wanted was gold, so he promised whole rooms of silver and gold to buy his freedom. He was so confident that he would regain his empire that when Huáscar was en route to join him in captivity, he had his men kill him, one of the few Inca who may have been able to lead a resistance. He ordered his armies to stay put and cooperated with Pizarro and the other commanders. Of course, Atahualpa was likely never going to be released. Believing that he was assembling an army to save himself, Diego de Almagro, one of Francisco's lieutenants, argued that the Inca should be killed for treason, and he was ultimately garroted on July 26, 1533. Killing Atahualpa was not met with universal sadness. For the losers of the recent civil war, he had been an enemy. Huáscar's faction found a willing ally in Francisco Pizarro, who knew that even with reinforcements, his grip on Peru was tenuous. Pizarro quickly assembled local lords and dignitaries to crown a new Sapa Inca with all the appropriate tradition and fanfare, the eldest surviving brother of Huáscar and Atahualpa, called Tupac. But Tupac survived only a short time before dying of illness, or less probably he was poisoned by supporters of Atahualpa. The Spanish still wished for a puppet Inca they could use to keep the local population compliant. Manco decided he could be that man, and introduced himself to the Spanish soldiers on their way to Cuzco. Manco had support in the capital, and supporting Manco gave Pizarro a veneer of legitimacy as they arrived in Cuzco to crown the new Sapa Inca. Pizarro told the 18-year-old prince that the Spaniards wanted to liberate the people of Cuzco. Manco was happy to work with the Spanish and sought revenge against the still rebellious Atahualpalists, and even raised 5,000 soldiers to accompany the Spanish cavalry in hunting down Inca generals. The Spanish happily plundered the great capital. One Spanish clergyman said that the conquistadors looted without thinking they were doing wrong, and were wrecking and destroying, for what was being destroyed was more perfect than anything they enjoyed and possessed. Manco and the Spaniards chased off the remaining Atahualpalists to the north, and Pizarro could consider a large part of the Inca Empire conquered. Francisco himself advocated for lenient treatment of the natives, largely because he feared a rebellion. Manco was well treated at first, but he faced a daunting task in trying to reform the young empire. Conquered tribes and powerful local lords openly threw off the yoke of the empire, and others worked with the Spanish, who they thought were a better option than the devil they knew. The Spanish, too, had their quarrels, especially between Francisco Pizarro and his brothers and Diego de Almagro. Diego had been a part of the expedition since its inception, was angry that Francisco had spoken to the Spanish king to make himself governor of the new territory. Almagro also thought he should have control over Cuzco. Manco sided mostly with Almagro in his split, and as time went on, the Spanish began ignoring Manco's supposed authority, returning to looting. Most of the conquistador leadership vacated Cuzco to pursue various military campaigns, leaving Francisco's brothers, Juan and Gonzalo, in charge at Cuzco. The two brothers openly abused Manco, Gonzalo decided that he wanted a native mistress and chose Manco's wife and sister and took her by force. Spaniards continually demanded more gold that they felt was being kept from them. Manco's advisors begged him, "Let us rebel once and for all. Let us die for our liberty." Manco tried to escape in 1535, but was quickly captured and held in chains for months. He reported that some of the conquistadors urinated on him and later said that, "I rebelled more on account of the abuses done to me than because of the gold they took from me. For they called me a dog, and they struck me, and took my wives and the lands that I farmed." He was released, but no amount of kindness could bring him back under the Spanish spell. The following year, Manco asked for permission to perform some religious rites in a nearby village, and promised to bring back a large gold idol. He was allowed to leave on April 18th, 1536. It was a ruse, and instead he met with a group of chiefs and soldiers and committed himself to ending the Spanish occupation. Upon figuring out their mistake, the Spaniards sent 70 horsemen after Manco, nearly every horse they had available, to find that there were already thousands of Inca waiting for them. The Spanish were barely able to return to Cuzco, which was already being surrounded. "So many troops came that they covered the fields," said one of the conquistadors. In complete secrecy, an enormous force had been brought together, one of the last great feats by the Inca Empire. Estimates of the army's size vary widely, ranging from 40,000 to 200,000. The Inca occupied the great citadel of Sacsayhuaman and spent weeks gathering their forces, while some 190 Spaniards with 80 horsemen and many native allies cowered in the city. When they finally attacked, Manco's forces struck from everywhere at once. Inca slingers fired heated stones to light the city on fire, and the Spanish retreated to a handful of buildings in the city center. The Spanish position was untenable. To alleviate it, they assaulted the Inca citadel, and after fierce fighting, were able to take it, though Juan Pizarro was killed. The Spaniards held their ground, and despite the huge force of Inca, were able to capture some supplies that kept them alive. Francisco sent relief forces from Lima, but allied Inca forces were prepared. Using their knowledge of the terrain, they trapped the Spanish columns in narrow defiles and dropped stones on them, ultimately killing hundreds of conquistadors. Pizarro named a new Sapa Inca and sent him under guard from Lima, but the guards were killed and the puppet defected to Manco. Manco had sent a force to assault Lima while he besieged Cuzco, which successfully cut off communication between the Spanish. Was even then converging on Pizarro's new capital. Pizarro was desperate. He recalled as many soldiers from other parts of the kingdom as he could and wrote desperate pleas to Spaniards in Panama, Guatemala, and elsewhere. The first report of the rebellion that reached Spain blamed it on Francisco's half-brother, Hernando Pizarro, because he had tortured the chief, Manco. Just as it seemed that the Inca would defeat the invaders, things started to go wrong. The attack on Lima was spectacularly defeated when the general fell in the first few minutes of battle. Across the country, the Spaniards at Cuzco struck out to assault the headquarters where Manco was, but found that the Inca had learned from all the fighting. Some of the Inca now carried Spanish steel, rode horses, and even attempted to use the captured arquebuses. Inca engineers flooded the fields to slow down the Spanish cavalry. The attack failed, but the Spanish were still supplied and held out. What ultimately shifted the balance was the return of Diego de Almagro, who had been fighting in Chile. Almagro hoped to secure Cuzco for himself and attempted to get Manco on his side, but by then the Inca trusted none of the Spanish and refused to be made again a puppet. The Inca abandoned the siege, while Almagro secured the city and imprisoned Hernando and Gonzalo Pizarro. Another of Manco's brothers sided with Almagro and later Pizarro and became the new puppet, Sapa Inca. Almagro sent a force after Manco to try and tie up loose ends, only to find that Manco was already retreating. His great army disintegrated as he retreated to Vilcabamba, a remote district where the mountains could protect him. Manco barely escaped with his life. The Spaniards fought, but Almagro was defeated and executed in 1538. In turn, followers of Almagro's son assassinated Francisco Pizarro 3 years later in retaliation. Manco continued fighting a guerrilla war from his new base, but never again threatened Spanish control of the region. Manco's so-called Neo-Inca state actually survived the empire by several decades until it was finally destroyed in 1572. Manco harbored several Almagro supporters who helped to train his army in horsemanship and European tactics, but unfortunately the Spanish betrayed him one more time. The Spaniards murdered Manco in 1544 in the hopes of winning a pardon from the Spanish. They were then killed by Inca soldiers. Many of Manco's sons ruled as a successor state until the Spanish finally assaulted the Neo-Inca and killed the last Sapa Inca, Manco's son Tupac, in 1572. What had begun with the execution of Atahualpa 40 years earlier ended with the execution of his nephew, and the Inca ceased to exist as a political force. Despite the seeming ease of their fall, for one brief moment the great empire rose up, despite the vast technological deficit, to fight against the Spanish invaders. And they very nearly succeeded.
Now for the fun part. where I, the history guy himself, and a longtime friend of the history guy, Brad Wagnon, discuss what might have happened if this had all gone differently. So the Inca were the largest empire in the Americas when the Spanish arrived, and it is an interesting quirk of history that the Spanish happened to show up when they did. And I think ultimately, from the story that you told in this episode, that's probably the most the part that stands out the most. Is that if there was anyone after the Aztecs' fall, if there was anyone in the Americas that was going to be able to stand up to the Spanish, it seemed like it would be the Inca. And between showing up at just the most inopportune time for the Incan Empire, and then also, honestly, Atahualpa just made some mistakes. Repeatedly.
Yeah, made some choices. And, his father had been a much, better war leader. And so it might have been, and not civil war at the time. So, yeah, I mean, the question, because we hear whenever you talk about the Americas at all, really, I mean, the question is, colonizers. And which is a fair point. But, I mean, there's a real question that says that at the moment that Columbus showed up in Hispaniola, I mean, was America lost? Was there any chance that America could stand against Europe in any way? And the closest to that, the one that is probably most interesting, although the Aztecs are an interesting question too, but the closest to that is the Inca. Because, I mean, there were literally periods where they had, thousands of guys there, and there was a handful of Spanish guys there, and still they managed to conquer it. So this is the real question, because it's a very easy to say as a counterfactual. It's very realistic to believe that the Inca could have defeated Pizarro. And then that, leads to the question, what would it mean? What would it have meant to, especially the future? I mean, the whole both continents. It might have made a difference if the conquistadors had, instead of going and conquering all of South America, if they'd wander off and never came back, would that have changed how Europe responded to the New World?
Yeah, I think that probably the first thing is that the obvious draw is the untold wealth that is coming from the New World. So, and this in turn allows Spain to be ascendant in Europe for several decades, if not a couple of centuries. So yeah, definitely there's a huge effect on the European side, and in the New World. I think that some of our counterfactual discussion does bring up some possibilities for some alternate timelines, if you will, that are very radically different than what we have now. I would say also that one of the counterfactuals is, what if the Incan Empire is not swimming in gold?
That's true. What if they get there and there's nothing that they want? Yeah. If they're like, hey, here's avocados, and they're like, well, that's not what we came for. It'll be rotten before it gets back to the king. Then, that changes. Not only does it change the Spanish motivations, but you're right. It changes all of Europe if Spain isn't suddenly awash in all the silver. Yeah. Good point.
Of course, after they had found the Aztecs with the gold, they were remarkably stubborn about finding more. So we did an episode on the German Venezuela, which was led by Germans. Most of the people were serving under them were Spanish, but gosh, they spent forever trying to find a secret city of gold, and variously destroying and being destroyed by all kinds of native groups.
Yeah, well, one of the reasons that as a colony it never succeeded is whoever got there as a leader would just abandon the colony because he was off searching for gold. That's what they really wanted, and so they're competent people were just constantly trekking off into the wilderness.
So do they keep going after the Inca even if they don't find gold, because they just are sure?
That's why, and it's different because the North American colonies, the idea was that they were going to really exploit the trees, the not just go find gold from the natives, but actually build a going economy there that was going to pay itself back. That's very different than what we're going to do is stomp around and take everybody's gold. So much so that it devalued gold. So it's a different model. If the Inca had stood against the Spanish, if they had defeated Pizarro, would the Spanish have kept coming? Or if we even go to another counterfactual, which is to say the Inca still fall, but they fall to the English or to the Germans, how different would the whole way that the colonization of the Americas go? It's an interesting question, because it is very meaningful. It's specifically meaningful that it was the Spanish that overcame the Inca Empire and came out with all that money. And would that have been different if it had been the Dutch?
Yeah.
Or the Portuguese? I mean, who were certainly in the same general vicinity, and had been trekking all the way across the rest of the world.
Part of the question is, could the Inca have defeated a sizable force? Because, I mean, from what we saw, fairly small forces of Spanish were able to do incredible amounts of damage. But part of that, I mean, the fight when they capture Atahualpa there at Cajamarca, I think is where they were, had to do with the fact that they were unprepared to fight armored Spanish. They did have some firearms, but they're not a whole lot of them. But also on horseback, which the Inca had never faced before. And so you do think that after, if they are able to essentially not have the entire government collapse instantly, maybe they would be able to figure out how to deal with the Spanish.
Well, especially with the huge difference, because how many men could the Spanish send? I mean, so it was never going to be, they were never going to pack over a European-sized army. And so how many, so clearly, I mean, when Pizarro says when he was trekking through the mountains there, he said, if they'd attacked me here, we couldn't have done squat. So clearly, if they'd understood strategy, if they'd understood who they were facing, there was many ways that they could have won. Yeah. I mean, even if, when Atahualpa came, he didn't arm his troops, right? No. He just brought people. What if he brought army there? Which leads to another possible counterfactual. What if, Pizarro shows up with his 40 dudes or whatever, and there's 4,000 dudes there with spears, and, Pizarro's captured, or Pizarro is intimidated into, I'm not going to try to take it, because what's going to happen, or there's a very good chance what's going to happen, is they're going to try to enlist him in the Civil War, which leads to this, what about the possibility that the Inca start acquiring the technology that the Spanish came? What would it mean if the Inca became, musketry armed? What would it mean if the Inca had captured or purchased or traded or coerced the Spanish technology? I mean, would that mean, all of South America? I mean, the Incas certainly seemed to be perfectly willing to colonize anybody they could defeat. So, I mean, what would that have meant if there had been a new world power that had the power of the Incan Empire, which was astounding already, but also had the European weapons? Because that's another way that could have gone. So, I mean, could they have defeated Pizarro? If they defeated Pizarro, what would the Spanish have done? How many Spaniards did you need before you could just defeat them based on technology alone? Those are really, really good questions.
Yeah, you wonder if they would be able to, because they never had iron metallurgy, and so with capturing these arquebuses that they captured from the Spanish, if they say capture or kill Pizarro essentially right at the beginning, would they have been able to reverse engineer those? Would they have ever been able to? How long would it have taken them to be able to, say, produce their own and figure out that kind of stuff?
What we kind of found is that if you capture a dude, it's not too hard to convince the dude to show you how to do things. Yeah. It would be surprising if there wasn't someone on that expedition who could help them, smelt iron. To go all the way up to making firearms. But I mean, it's pretty quickly you can change some technology pretty fast. But I mean, what if Pizarro thinks that the best way to do this is to ally with one faction or another and to actually arm that faction, and that could be things. What if instead of just running for gold, if Pizarro was himself trying to become the emperor? Absurd to think what would happen if we started bringing the new world technology. It didn't take them long. It didn't take it certainly didn't take the the North American, the Plains Indians long to figure out how to use horses and guns as well too. So absolutely.
It transforms their culture.
Quickly, Europeans figure out, for whatever they're trading for, they figure out guns are an easy thing to trade. So, I mean, all over the world, fairly archaic cultures, what we're playing in Civilization 2 or 3 or something like that. They run into a woodsman and they're like, oh, hey, you want muskets? Here you go. I'll give you muskets for, whatever you got. And pretty quickly, they changed the world that way. So I think that's possible. I think that it's possible that the transfer of technology, and the thing about the Columbian exchange is it seems to be like, the old world got all the good stuff and the new world got all the bad stuff. But what if it kind of goes the other direction? What if the technologies of the old world end up going to the new world? So, I mean, to the point where you could literally say not only could maybe North America or the Americas have defeated Europe, but maybe invasion fleets are showing up in Andalusia, right? Or Portugal's wondering like who all these guys just showed up in their big ships trying to take over. Yeah, I guess Portugal's been through it before. They probably just assumed that they were Moors, but and the thing is, for all you want to say about colonizers and et cetera, I mean, the Inca were as warlike as any European power.
Yeah, they had this concept that if you were the emperor or the royal family, essentially would, after they died, they still owned the land that they had conquered. And so there was almost a requirement that if you were going to become the new emperor, you had to go conquer more land to, in order to make money for yourself. And that's, first of all, that's eventually, of course, that's that you're going to run out of land to conquer. They didn't have that problem.
It's hard to, rule over distance, and the people are going to be more restive. So, you could argue maybe that the Incan Empire had gone about as far as the Incan Empire was going to go by the time that the Spanish showed up, or you could argue that the Incan Empire could have, kept going, and at some point were the Incas and the Aztecs going to, run into each other.
It was an incredible culture. They literally didn't have writing as we understand it. The Inca didn't. I would say that the Quipu was maybe more complex than we.
They could keep pretty complex records with those, apparently.
Yeah. In so many other places, you'd say, you can't have a civilization without a written language. And the Inca, either had a very different written language than we understood it, or essentially were running without one. And they were clearly a powerful. There was significant bureaucracy, and they were literally. Their fastest way to get from one part of the kingdom to another was literally just run on the roads.
But they didn't have horses. Just like the Romans, they built roads, and they built roads that allowed them to move rather quickly and move troops rather quickly around the empire. There's a lot of things that are quite. So it's hard to imagine that you could build Machu Picchu. And say that because they didn't have writing, they didn't have the technology to keep. Because there had to be some understanding of that we would have to write down in order to build the structures that they were finding there. And we don't really know. There's a lot of New World empires that we don't know that much about. But how far they could have gone.
Yeah,
maybe they discovered writing.
I'm a little skeptical as to the possibility of the Inca. And one of the technological advances that is very, very hard to overcome is not only the lack of a written language, but the lack of the use of the wheel. And
fair point.
Yeah, that is the basis for so much in the way, not only logistically, but also for mechanical engineering. So, I really don't see that the Inca
you couldn't use
were ever in a position where they were going to get to the point where they could, build their own ships, cannon, arquebus, and then, sail over and say, capture the Dutch East Indies.
Would have been wild.
The other thing is, I'm really not sure what type of situation there is in South America along the coast there for iron. Obviously, they had gold and silver in certain areas, but other than that, you have mentions of salt mines. In fact, one of the battles takes place near a salt mine. But that's largely because, nutritionally, if you don't have salt and you're human, you cease to be alive after a certain period of time. So you've got to have that. However, I think that I do like the idea that, or I do like a possibility of, the Inca show up on the battlefield. Atahualpa actually has his men armed and goes in with a little less naivete. Mm-hmm. Because that's actually kind of a question that keeps popping into my head, and that is, what is Atahualpa thinking at this point? Is he thinking that I literally am a god? These Spanish will simply fall to the ground in my awe, or is he under the impression that I've got roughly 80,000 men within a day's march of here, and they would surely not start a war? Basically, seize me overnight. But obviously that's what they did. If the initial Spanish foray into the Incan Empire had been turned, I think that's a very high possibility, because you've only got 200 men. In fact, at this point, if I'm not mistaken, Almagro actually is up in Panama trying to get some additional troops to come down and join. So yeah, I think that's actually I think that's a fairly likely possibility.
Yeah, it's very believable. But early scrimmage, you grab one, and then he's feared for his life.
Mm-hmm.
So he tells them, what the strengths of horses are, that they're not demons, that could mean a significantly better prepared. Those arquebuses loaded very, very slowly. An army of people with spears could easily defeat them if you just use your wits about you. And so they just, they didn't know what they were dealing with. But it's not hard to see where it's possible if they did. But one counterfactual to ask is let's just say that the 200 guys wander off. And not a one of them comes back out because 80,000 guys managed to kill or capture or keep all 200, so that there's no one comes back. How do the Spanish react, and what happens next? And it's a good question.
Certainly, it seems likely that more people are going to show up, and not necessarily because they are out for revenge, but purely because. That happened a lot, was that you had people wander off and not come back, or only some of them came back. If none of them come back, they at least don't have the...
they're not showing up with a bunch of gold saying, oh, here, look at all the stuff we have. Yeah.
Then you have a lot of people coming back. But you still think that if Atahualpa figured out that their intentions were bad, and that they were dangerous, extremely dangerous, you still think that if they are simply prepared, that they could use their knowledge of the terrain and their understanding of how the Spanish are going to fight, and kill a lot of Spanish. It seems like you could kill quite a few Spanish coming at you before everything went to pieces. But it's how many times do they send people? And how many more do they send? It does seem like if they know that there's an empire full of gold there, that they will send as many people as they can send. But there is a fair question on how many can you send.
Yeah, you're not going to pack a whole army off to the new world.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I will say that the likely candidate who would have shown up next probably would have been Pedro de Alvarado, who I believe is Cortez's second in command, and has seen firsthand the beautiful treasures of empires in Mesoamerica. He actually heads down to Guatemala, more or less conquers his own state, but doesn't find the fabulous riches. And just a couple of years later, he actually shows up at the same time as Pizarro and Almagro, and is in danger, or is threatening Pizarro's ability to come in and basically claim the Incan Empire without contest. Yeah, I would say that tradition would keep going, especially because of the huge amount of gold and silver that was coming out of the Aztec Empire. That was how many times in human history have we seen a gold rush? Mm-hmm. They tend to last several decades. They tend to be very persistent, and they bring out the best and the worst of humanity.
That's a fair point, because regardless of what came out of the Inca Empire at first, if the Aztec Empire was going to probably keep them wanting to come. Though, the numbers were always going to be piecemeal. There was, if you understood the tactics, it's not hard to see the Incas resisting, at least for a very long time. And how much are they eventually going to be ravaged by European disease too? That's a good question on how far they could have gone.
Well, they're definitely already being ravaged by disease.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and how much farther would that go? Would eventually lead to social collapse, even if they didn't have the Civil War going. I'm generally of the opinion that the New World could never have resisted. That the total conquest of the Americas was pretty much something that was going to be inevitable. It's just a matter of how much time it took. I think that's kind of where the weight of it goes. But what if all the Plains Indians, what if the North American Indians or tribes, nations, actually banded together instead of constantly squabbling and working as smaller groups and et cetera? And if they had understood what was going on with European settlement and had resisted differently early on, then could that have changed history? So this is even closer to that, in that it was actually a unified group. But I think in the end, you're right. The European quest for gold was so powerful that it seems to have been irresistible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and it doesn't hurt that basically during this period of time that there was a bumper crop of very ruthless and very driven men coming from the old world who were willing to pay the price of other people's blood for their own aggrandizement.
Yeah, yeah. It's certain that if it wasn't Pizarro, which it certainly didn't have to be, if it had ended very badly for Pizarro, it might have given the Inca a longer period. But how long does it take them to recover from that civil war? Because, I mean, just like with the Aztecs, there were always going to be groups of people who were willing to overthrow.
Well, it seems like
the
because they
empire.
keep finding brothers and half brothers, and I mean, this seems like never ending. So yeah, I mean, they might have been on the verge of collapse regardless of the Spanish there. And if in all of these, if the Inca survive, who survives, and whether it's it's a reformer, whether it's someone that's more conservative, whether it's a military commander, that all changes. I mean, Inca culture was going to be changed by the contact. And how that was changed by the contact really, kind of depends. And so that becomes pretty complex in counterfactuals. But I mean, when you're asking not only do the Incas survive, but who survives, and how does that change the Incan Empire, and what does that mean for the future? Those are interesting questions as well.
Well, and we know remarkably little about. We know some more about, say, Manco, but of Atahualpa himself, I don't think we know enough to really understand what kind of leader he would have been.
The Spanish don't show up. The Spanish just don't show up. What happens to the Incan Empire in the Civil War? How would that eventually shake out?
Yeah, because we were right at the very end. Atahualpa had essentially just managed to capture his main opponent. That did not mean the Civil War was necessarily over, and it certainly didn't mean that the wounds caused by the Civil War were over. And was he going to be able to put down revolts?
Would he have been a good ruler? I mean, would he have been one that kept them together?
Yeah.
Or we would have started to see the empire fragment. It's a
which does eventually happen. And they were at about, we talked last time about, 150 years or so that the empires last. They were roughly at 100 years there. And so we were getting to the point where, in the next generation or two, you expect some issues. And how those issues shake out, and whether, with Rome, sometimes you'd have periods of decline, and then you'd have a good emperor show up, and things go well for a little while, and then it all happens again. And I don't know how. It's really hard to see, given what we know, exactly how that kind of history would have worked with the Inca. And just like the Spanish saw opportunity when they showed up in the middle of the Civil War, people who did not like Atahualpa and people who didn't like, his whole line were always going to see opportunity when the Spanish showed up. As you said, eventually they were going to try to pull him into one side or another.
Yeah, it feels to me that for the Inca really to have resisted for any period of time, they would have had to have essentially Europeanized. And that, both in terms of tactics, because that's who they were fighting. But it seems to me that the way that would have given them the best chance of persisting is if they presented themselves as if they were a European power and put the Spanish in the position where they have to negotiate with them, which completely changes the whole game. If the Inca survive, but they essentially become another, European state that happens to be in Central America, South America, how much they hang on to their culture, that's interesting. And, what happens to religion? What happens to mythology? Do they have to pick up writing in order to be able to do that? If the Inca did survive, it's hard to imagine they could have survived and looked like the Inca.
Yeah. You see that with, say, much later, but the way that Japan responded, after they stopped being so insular, they clearly saw that their options were, remain a backward power or become like the Europeans. And the Inca would have had something of that choice too. But even if they, didn't make the choice, as you said, what they're going to learn in terms of metallurgy, writing, any of that stuff is going to absolutely revolutionize Incan society. And ultimately, what happens to the Inca is just mass death between diseases and just absolutely straight murder and being used to mine and all that stuff. I was reading some stuff that suggests that probably something like 75 to 90% of the population
and the whole
ends
culture
up dying.
really disappears. Yeah. It's hard to imagine this powerful, vibrant empire and literally just reduced to ash.
Yeah, and also I think it's the nature of the empire, because this particular empire really is based, and I'm trying to think what the European equivalents would be, or Asiatic equivalents would be. But it is an empire that is really based on the loyalty of conquered tribes. It is an interesting question as to where do you go from there. Yeah, it's hard to see that the Incan Empire is going to go on for much longer. And what I base that on is the fact that essentially they are already in the process of moving entire populations from one part of the empire to the other to try to minimize the resistance. And of course, that ultimately plays against them when the Spanish show up, because you have plenty of people who are reeling from the effects of basically being uprooted from their homeland.
And that goes back to the question, what if the Spanish don't even show up? Still, what happens? The Inca Empire might have collapsed nearly as quickly. It might have been on the verge of that. It's hard to say, but certainly there are reasons to think that, and it leads back to a larger counterfactual about the whole New World, Old World thing, is that if Europe left the New World alone, if they found a different way to the Spice Islands or whatever, how does the New World develop? At what point does the New World, pick up metallurgy? At what point does the New World develop on a European model, or do they essentially remain in the Stone Age for, 300 years?
Well, and that's, the Inca, in terms of how civilization is built, did look different than a lot of the, the stuff that happened in the Middle East, and all of the European civilization since that. It happened slightly differently. And unfortunately, we just don't have enough, we don't have a large number of groups to look at to really understand, what that means in terms of like all human civilization. But it's interesting because, did they need to, we kind of saw that this idea that there was a natural progression of, bronze to iron to, and what does that exist? Is that necessary, or could the Inca have continued building an empire?
We know that the Central American, the South American empires built stuff. We don't have any idea how they did that. So clearly they had, technology that it was on a different tree. They were making different choices on their technology tree when they were playing Civ, and who knows what that would have looked like, or how that would have turned into things.
It's really crazy to look at some of those fortresses that the Inca built and imagine that they did that without horses
or wheels.
They had llamas. Yeah.
They had llamas. Mm-hmm. But they didn't. Those were not heavy pack
40-ton
animals.
Stones or 400-ton stones is the stuff they're using there. Yeah. Well, yeah, but could they? I'm not sure what kind of horses they were bringing. Could they have made a breeding stock out of what the Spanish brought? If they had defeated Pizarro, would they have had enough horses to become,
If they had captured several horses?
I don't know if you took geldings, or if you brought broodmares, or who, I have no idea who the Spanish were riding at the time, because they only had a handful. But presumably they had both, studs and mares, right? And presumably they could have. But it wasn't exactly terrain that was conducive to cavalry. But it might have allowed them to go beyond the range of the llama.
Certainly, it could have transformed, how they used pack animals. The horse was a very different animal than the llama, and would have been. As the Europeans learned, could pull much heavier things, and maybe that would have really changed how the Inca did things.
Spanish horses, though, they completely changed culture in North America. And it didn't take them very long to figure out how to do that.
Oh yeah, part of that might have been that the horses, ran into areas that they could live in easily, and that would not have been quite as true.
A little bit less horse friendly.
I do think that you also have to realize that horses also add an element to agriculture that simply the Inca did not have. Based on everything that I've seen, basically, almost the entire empire was based on peasantry using hand tools, and they did have some magnificent. Their terraced fields. Obviously, those are engineering marvels, and that shows that with enough time and enough effort, you can do incredible things, and they certainly did incredible things. However, introducing a draft animal. That not only you can ride into battle, but one who can traverse the length of the empire in, a couple of days versus a week, and pull a plow. These are all things that, horses really are revolutionary.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, but I mean, is it in the same way? Do you get the same plow? I don't know, but
if we think about it, the mortarboard plow is a relatively recent addition. Before that, it was basically a scratch plow. And the other piece of the puzzle is that what happens when you finally or do you actually get the technology together that allows farmers to use horses instead of something else? Now, that's a very European question because obviously the Inca don't have oxen.
Yeah, which is different.
Or other draft animals. Yeah.
And I don't know that I guess I don't know enough about llamas to say it with certainty, but I don't think you can use llamas very similarly to the way that you use oxen.
Is the territory, again, is that going to be, amenable to oxen? Is it going to be like wide enough trails that you can take oxen? So, I think the llama was the right animal for most of the terrain that they were passing. And I don't know, did llamas ever pull plows? I mean, how would they use as draft animals? I wish I should have researched that more. I was just talking about camels today, so.
I don't think that they were. Yeah, all of the research that I've been looking at, just suggests that, again, the vast majority of Incan society, where they were using picks, hoes, and various other farm implements, but they were all handheld.
And that goes back to without European contact, then how far does this society develop? And what does that look like in the long run? I mean, maybe they're the first ones to have flying cars, but I mean, maybe 10 centuries later, they're still, in the Stone Age.
I don't know if we know the answer exactly about what it took, for Bronze Age civilizations exactly to move into the Iron Age. I mean, the exact and why or if that would have happened with the Inca, I don't know. I don't know if we have enough understanding to really get what that might have required.
What do we
or what
really
it would
know about Incan science? I mean, whether and study and again, there's a lot of gaps there and that we just didn't learn to collapse so quickly.
Yeah, and I'm not sure that there really is much in the way of Incan science, per se.
No, it had to be. I mean,
let me qualify that.
The Nazca lines and Machu Picchu, and I mean, they were doing stuff that required some very good engineering knowledge to be able to do that. But I mean, how was that being grown and spread, and who owned it? Probably there's people that are more expert that could talk to that. So I mean, it might be. I'm sure there's people that could speak a little bit more effectively to where would the Inca have gone if the Europeans hadn't arrived. But I mean, it's still again, the empire collapsed pretty quickly thereafter, and there's a lot we don't know about the culture. And so that would help to answer the question. What would but I mean, if you stumbled into Roman Britain, would you know where Britain's going to go for 100 years or 1,000 years? If I don't know that we really know what all the keys were in Western societies, but I mean, what was Inca astronomy like? I don't know. That was very much a key to navigation and changing rules, and so I mean, some of that is what if you captured Spaniards, or what if the Spaniards were working with you or whatever? Then that could have changed, and how much would that change culture? But the other question is, say, how would you normally would just on some sort of normal development would eventually they discover gunpowder, and how would that change what happens in South America? It's a fair question.
Yeah.
I mean, it really is. I mean, if you want to play a game of Civ and say what happens, how does that culture just develop over time?
Yeah, I think that ultimately what you would need to get any kind of advancement of the Incan Empire beyond what they had currently, a more universal education system where you have something more than just an aristocracy that gets any kind of an education whatsoever. And then,
is that going on in Spain at the time? I mean, are you really saying that they're educating the population?
I wouldn't say universal, and I shouldn't say universal education, but I should say that you have an educated. One of the things that I think is necessary for a culture to make a certain leap from one point to another is enough education with a critical mass. Let's call it that. So yes, 95% of the population, has a very basic education. They know enough about what they're doing, but you do have to have a class of people who constantly think about what's next, or, we have knowledge of how things work in a very educated way based on what we know, and we're able to exchange and test these ideas.
Yeah, which is developing in Europe at the time, which might have been the biggest.
And that feels like,
difference
we're
between
talking
the two.
about, a merchant or a middle class, but also something, one of the things that was so important in Europe was the monks. Where do the second and third sons go, and they end up being educated, and all the scientific stuff that came out of monasteries, essentially, and colleges and stuff like that. And even though that was still, a relatively small number of people, that's where a lot of innovation can come from. And I don't honestly know what the Inca had as far as that.
If you boil it down to its basic components, the people of the Incan Empire, they woke up each day and it was, okay, what am I going to do in the fields? What am I going to do with my llama?
Mm-hmm.
How am I going to finish weaving the cloth that I'm supposed to finish? Those are the primary questions for the vast majority of the people in the empire.
No, I still think that was true of a lot of people in Spain, too, at the same time. I'm not sure that they were that far culturally advanced. But, you're right about monasteries and universities. They're at least these centers of learning. But we've talked a lot about, what it means for the New World. But we just kind of touched on, if Spain doesn't get the gold. So, what if the Inca, by whatever method resists Spain? And there's no Spanish Golden Age. There's no, richest country in Europe. The Habsburgs are not, this is a period where Spain dominates Europe. So how different would it be if they had lost this particular battle? Because even the money that's coming from the Philippines essentially has to come through Central South America. So how different is Europe? Who's the power if Spain doesn't have all of the wealth that they got from the New World?
Of course, Portugal was in a good position. But that has a lot to do with what they were doing in the East, with the Indian trade routes. Mm-hmm. Certainly, Spain would still have had a lot of money. They would have been a significant power. But you have to think that if they are unable to take advantage of the absolutely vast material resources of the Incan Empire, that has to significantly impact
the Potosi mine alone. But,
we had mentioned that it devalued gold. There's some possibility that, if they have a limit to the volume of precious metals they're bringing over, that actually could have improved to some extent their financial position. Because ultimately, what happens is that they fight so many wars trying to keep other European powers out. The gold has so devalued that they're unable to pay their debts.
That's it. Would they be a more resilient Spain if they hadn't? To me, intuitively, because they're competing with the Portuguese. If the Portuguese are able to exploit, the East as well as they did, and the Spanish are not able to exploit the New World in the way that they did, it seems to me that Portugal becomes a much more powerful state. And it's possible, like the Habsburgs, maybe Spain ends up becoming dominated by Portugal. But how different would Europe be if it's not the Habsburgs? Is Britain wealthier, because Spain hasn't devalued gold? What happens with the Habsburgs? Because they were dominating everywhere, Italy, the Netherlands. What if those, they don't have the ability to do that? And those are stronger powers at the time.
Holy Roman Empire
under the Habsburg
obviously
Empire.
Does not continue. What we would probably see is the Central and Northern European powers would become more powerful vis-a-vis Spain that does not have this sudden influx of wealth. And just to hop on to a different idea, without America and the potato, Western civilization itself is affected in a way that is the true alternate timeline catastrophe.
Is the potato.
I really agree with that. The potato is vital.
Yes.
And that's the Columbian Exchange. So, so that's a good point, because I've been saying like, how does the New World develop without the Old World? But how's the Old World develop without the New World? And potato was an interesting. There's turkeys and all sorts of stuff that they brought from the New World, but maize, right? That came from the New World, right? But,
tomatoes. But gosh, of all of them, potatoes so changed our ability of so many people to eat food. You look at an example like Ireland, where they were able to essentially live off of only potatoes, and I think that's the advantage of the potato,
and support families on very small plots of land. That was the point of what happened. But Frederick the Great, right? I believe the potatoes would
in a world without McDonald's
the whole empire
and those golden fries, it's not a world worth living in.
It's all coffee now. You thought Europe was known for its coffee. But if you go to Europe now, there's signs for McDonald's coffee everywhere. It's like their Starbucks is
That's
McDonald's.
interesting, because I would never have called.
So I don't. It said McDonald's doesn't advertise hamburgers very much in Europe. In my experience, they advertise their coffee. If you're in Vienna, there's these little signs that are built onto the poles that tell you how many feet to a McDonald's with a picture of a coffee cup. What were they eating in Ireland before potatoes?
I wonder that too. What were we doing before? Because it seems like, when we talk about
they were growing grain.
Yeah, so many of these staple foods, and it's like, oh, those came from the New World. You do wonder, I mean, without that, what does Europe look like?
Yeah, there is, and unfortunately, in my copious 8 seconds of free time, I have not been able to read the book, but there is a book that says the potato, the savior of Western civilization. Dang it! Now I'm going to have to go hit Amazon and see if they've got a copy, or head down to my local Barnes and Noble because. So
is Europe much less powerful without
yes.
potatoes, or much lower population? And is there some point where that causes a European collapse, or it causes
You could certainly argue that the movement into the modern world and the level of one of the most important things in the building of this modern world is our ability to produce large amounts of food in small areas. I mean, that is how we are going to be able to start moving toward a more highly
urbanized.
That's what I'm looking for. A higher urbanized civilization. And that's essentially.
It's what let us survive Malthusian economics.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah. I mean, that we had something.
Malthus' argument is that we're going to have some sort of mass die-off just for the fact that you're making more people than you can make food.
But if the food keeps up.
Yeah. And also let us contemplate a world without bourbon. Because maize/corn, as we Americans like to call it, is a necessary ingredient.
Well, what does Russia do without vodka?
The New World is extremely important to the survival of the Old World. I think that it's very ethnocentric of us.
Yeah.
To try to say, the question is what would happen to the New World, and not understand exactly how much the New World affected the Old World.
If you don't conquer the Inca, that does not necessarily mean, I guess, that potatoes don't get to Europe. It certainly makes it more difficult. If you don't understand potatoes the way the Inca did.
What if it's 50 years later? And I would say that you would have even then you would have ripple effects that would definitely be major. Yeah, the humble potato is one of history's under-debated important contributions.
It may have been part of the reason why the Inca were able to do what they were able to do. It's also kind of incredible to think, when we talk about great empires and something like the Inca and the Spanish, that the most important part of it might be looking at the root vegetable.
Now, if you think about it, let's flash back to the Roman Empire. Is the Roman Empire able to exist in the way that we know it without Egypt, the breadbasket of the Roman Empire? Probably not.
Mm-hmm.
Probably not. Yeah, that's flatly, food ends up being a vital piece of human civilization. And I think a lot of times when you talk about history, you forget to include the fact that every person we've ever talked about was eating 3 times a day, at least, right? Or not eating 3 times a day. And that both of those have a huge impact on how history is able to happen. And the potato really did absolutely. I mean, we talk about how much the horses revolutionized Plains Indians. Potatoes might have had just as dramatic an impact on European culture.
Maybe more so. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good question to say. What was the most important things? Were the most important things to come out of the Columbian Exchange, and what most dramatically impacted things. And because you tend to think that the most dramatic part of the Columbian Exchange was smallpox, and in the New World, potatoes, and it's a good question. I'm not surprised that there's a good text on that somewhere that makes that argument.
I do think there's some important stuff. I mean, in terms of how we're talking about kind of the big picture of history that we can get out of how this happened, which is that as much as we've talked about. As you mentioned earlier, this weight of history, maybe the Inca never stood a chance, maybe the New World never stood a chance. But it also was surprisingly important, I think, to a lot of people, just how much the natives' choices made that difference. The particular way it happened had a lot to do with not just the situation, but in choices made by, millions of individual people, or all the many Native Americans that chose to fight with the Spanish. The big battle at the end of this one at Ollantaytambo, there were a handful of Spanish and tens of thousands of Native American auxiliaries. And it simply would not have been possible for the Spanish to do what they did without that kind of assistance.
Which means that they came in at a specific time. And that that's a question from the start. Columbus lands and he runs into the Taino, and the Taino are being apparently, set upon by the Caribs. At least that's the story that he's told at the time. What if he'd shown up, on the other side of the island? I mean, would they have stabbed him and put his head on a pole and burned the ship and said goodbye? Maybe if he'd run into the Caribs instead of the, because we're hearing the Taino version of the story there too. Yeah. Maybe the Caribs felt the other way, but I mean, what if the first group that he ran into was incredibly warlike and Columbus has a handful of guys? Then it makes for a whole different option.
And it doesn't always work out for the Europeans. Magellan ends up dying stupidly at a battle between native powers.
Yeah, he works the same way. He figures that he can just show up with a handful of guys and just demonstrate his technology, and that'll be great. Yeah. And he ends up being perforated many times in that.
It seems like that would have been possible for Pizarro to have been perforated.
Right. I mean, if Magellan could be defeated at Mactan, then Pizarro could have been defeated. If the New World knew what was coming, that might have made a big difference in this question of was it inevitable that they would be overrun by the Old World? Because at some point you got to make a bridgehead, right? I mean, you got to float over in ships that have to go a very long distance without a lot of food and get there and be able to hold the ground. And if they just like push you off every time your boat arrives, then it could be different. But if you like the Comanche, the Comanche held off the U.S. and Mexico for all of the 19th century. What if that had been what they ran into when they were landing in Virginia? The Powhatan Confederacy wasn't always completely friendly, but I mean, in some ways it was the same way. They were divided. They were trying to ally with them in certain ways. They still nearly wiped out Yorktown, right? Or
Jamestown.
But what if it had been as people as vicious and tenacious as some of the resistance that went on later in the Indian Wars? Could it have been so that Europe was like, okay, this is not the Spice Islands.
How many boats?
It's too much.
How many boats do you send?
This is too much work. Yeah. It's for us to.
Yeah. What if the Incan Empire is more like, say, the Vikings than?
I mean, that's the far end here. Is it possible that this could have gotten to the point where Incas were landing in Europe? It's hard to see it that way. It's really hard for me to see it anyway, where the Inca Empire survives contact. Eventually. Another thing that it was a comment that I made during the last session, but the Incans definitely were not a seagoing power.
No. I don't know that they had anything. I mean, I assume that people they had conquered had like canoes.
Yeah,
they were a mountain going people.
Which leads to part of what we were talking about with their science and learning, et cetera, because the key there too is astronomy. But they were playing a different game of Civ. They were using a different tech tree than anybody I've ever seen. And but I mean, who knows where that could wind up? But I mean, that says what if a group of 30 guys from Portugal figured out what was going on and showed up first and said, this is what's coming, and we're going to show you how to resist it. I mean, could they build their own Incan empire? Because then you could teach someone navigation, you could teach someone, metallurgy. But I mean, could any society survive that radical and quick a social change and still maintain an empire?
Yeah, the fact that the Inca Empire had been as stable as it had been up to that point, they were looking for a period of instability. And it's, of course, Atahualpa could have ended it and could have made, another period of growth. But if he had left his brother alive, Huascar, if Huascar and Atahualpa together had decided we are going to join forces and hold off the Spanish, then the Inca Empire has essentially enough cohesion probably to not just fall apart.
So there were a lot of choices there that made a huge difference. Well, again, too, if they just attacked them when they were in the jungle mountain, couldn't use your horse's place, then it all might not have made a difference. But I think when we go to counterfactuals, the most realistic version to say as a counterfactual is that could they have delayed by a matter of decades, the conquest, and that would transform kind of what's going on in Europe would change, how much wealth that the Spaniards have, which could transform things that are going on in Europe. How is the New World different if they resist for another 50 or 100 years? Does that slow colonization in other parts of the New World? I think those are very realistic in terms of counterfactuals, as opposed to kind of the general. I don't think that there's really any realistic counterfactual that comes out to the New World being a power that could, then float across the other direction.
And of course, England was not exactly known for their maritime neutrality when it came to Spanish galleons. So there were certainly other powers who were getting in on the goods while the getting was good.
And that might be different if the getting wasn't so good. That's true.
Yeah. How did the Spanish ever reach Cusco? If the Inca start by just killing you at the borders, you don't have any ability to build some kind of knowledge about what the roads look like. You were stuck trying to explore across a hostile land. It does seem like, it's not impossible for them to hold you off.
Mm-hmm. Guerrilla warfare in the Andes is a definite possibility. And how did the Spanish overcome that?
Yeah.
I'm going to harken back to a thought that was earlier, and a good question is, why did Spain conquer the empire so quickly? Well, when you put down a nice, a well-developed road system and put down food storehouses every few miles, you're definitely not doing any favors to yourself if you're on the defense against a rapidly moving army. Small numbers, obviously, you do have the ability to move a little more quickly, and cavalry multiply that ability even more. So,
yeah, but like Josh said, it was the large chunk of their army was always other Inca that were going to ally with them, and without those,
and that might have been true no matter what. Maybe even if the Inca are initially hostile and keeping them out, the Spanish are still able to find some group of people who are willing to say, okay, we'll help you through this,
and
march you through the mountains and
they're. But it was partly that was how the empire was built, right? Conquest meant that you fought for the new guy.
Now, what we have not considered is, were the Nazca figures engraved by aliens?
Oh, or for aliens.
Because they're only visible from the air.
Yeah. What if the Incas remember the code at the time and are able to call in their alien reinforcements? Then how does Pizarro deal when suddenly spaceships come in and start, slaughtering Spaniards with lasers?
Mm-hmm. This is and it's not even like aliens versus cowboys, because the Spanish have arquebus, not 6-shooters and Henry rifles.
Yeah, instead of the Inca in their tens of thousands running away from horses, I think you have the 100 Spaniards just absolutely running as fast as they can.
If you put together all the crazy theories about the Nazca lines, then that could suggest that maybe the Incas had some, vast power that they could have used against the. Part of the theory is that they were using balloons, right? They were using hot air balloons. That's one of the newer theories. What would that have meant if they were employing those in a military capacity?
Would have been amazing. And the Nazca lines are a legitimately interesting.
Yeah, they're awfully hard to explain.
How do you even make stuff like that when you can't look at them from above? It's that requires some good understanding of things like geometry or someone in a balloon.
Was there a technology there that the Inca had either forgotten how to use or didn't know how to apply militarily that could have been the tech that shifted the war? Or maybe the giant Thunderbird was a real thing. What's the Nazca line just rises up as a giant winged Godzilla, and
they'd only need one of those.
Probably so. One critter that size probably would have been enough to take out the 200.
After seeing what Mothra does to Tokyo in several episodes of Godzilla movies, clearly this is 200 Spanish don't even stand a chance.
One of the things I wondered about is I think a way that would have slowed Europe down from coming to the New World if the Black Death had simply hit a couple more times. The 1500s, they have either the Black Death or a similar disease that just, devastates European populations. You could move the ability of the Europeans to be traveling to the New World and to have the money and time and desire, quite honestly, by 100 or 150 years. you're still then, wondering what happens to the Inca after
if it makes that
150
long,
years.
It's a good point. Well, in the Columbian exchange, the New World got smallpox and just vastly devastating illnesses, and in return, they got syphilis in the Old World. But what if, and this is just as possible because the resistance is just the same. What if there had been some massive plague in the New World that the New World population had developed resistance to? And that plague, a plague that was as devastating to the New World as smallpox was, went back to Europe at that time because it's not long after the Black Death, right? So what if they had gotten there? What if there had been some version of smallpox that came back to with Columbus
and just wiped out 50% of the population or something like that? It seems like if you're suddenly dealing with, what they were dealing with in the Black Death, where you're just tossing bodies into piles and burning them because you can't even deal with the number of bodies that is, that you're not going to be all that interested in dealing with what he found in the New World just because you don't have the luxury of doing that.
Yeah. If there had been some sort of a New World influenza. In some ways, the New World was actually in a better position to survive something like that because you do not have a primarily urban, or you don't have nearly as many. You don't have nearly as much of your population in urban areas. And it's going to affect craftsmen, government officials, merchants, basically a lot of the people who were behind the push for exploration.
Yeah.
There was a lot in what happened in what we call the Columbian Exchange. But there was clearly that exchange seemed to work better for the Old World than for the New. At least I guess initially it meant bringing metalworking and clearly initially that exchange worked much more to the benefit of Europe and much more to the detriment of the peoples of the Americas. But there's no reason that it had necessarily to be that way. What if Columbus shows up and his boat full of men doesn't have resistance, and if 40% or 60% die of some illness, including most of the officers, can they ever get that boat home?
And if Columbus doesn't come back,
well, certainly we forget his name, but how long before the Old World could conquer the New World then, or does that just change the whole equation?
Thank you for listening to this episode of the History Guy podcast. We hope you enjoyed this episode of Counterfactual History, and if you did, you can find lots more history if you follow The History Guy on YouTube. You can also find us at thehistoryguy.com, Facebook, Patreon, and Locals. If you want to hear more Counterfactuals, stay tuned. We release podcasts every 2 weeks.